Okay, well, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Maria. I am a third year PhD student in music education with emphasis in piano pedagogy here at LSU. And I would like to thank Dr. Price for inviting me to come talk to you about my dissertation project. So today, like I said, I'm going to share a little bit about my pilot study that I did last semester and how it helped me guide and see what I need to change for my actual dissertation project. So the title of my study is Using Performance Cues as a Memorization Strategy with Group Piano Students by Implementing Teacher and Student-Directed Learning Approaches. So let me just start by giving some definitions, and then I will start by explaining a little bit about student-directed and teacher-directed learning approaches. There is an extensive amount of research comparing both styles of learning approach in all areas of study. For teacher-directed, students usually rely on teachers' knowledge to provide the information. For some students, this approach can be effective when the teaching is guiding their learning at the beginning until the students start to feel a little bit more confident to lead their own learning. Researchers such Bell and Bell analyze how this approach can be helpful for the students outside the music. So they did actually in nursing students. So it's really very broad. It can be outside and outside music. And a good example of teacher-directed in music can be found in Andrew's study from 2013, where he compared the use of teacher-directed in instrumental group. Andrew discussed that a good example of teacher-directed can be found in conductors, where they make most of the decisions regarding the pieces. So in teacher-directed, the teacher is helping the student to either understand something or learn in a way that will be helpful for them at that time. For student-directed, the goal is to become more independent and see the teacher as a facilitator in the learning. So what do I mean by facilitating the learning? For this process, the teacher can give time for the students to search for answers and use the classroom to engage the students to interact and learn from peers. When facilitating, the student will do the learning independently and the teacher will guide them to the correct way. That does not mean that the student is alone, but rather understanding and learning their own way and their own pace. Kunkel is another researcher that used this approach in a management class to foster the skills in class as a part of assignments throughout the semester. And another good musical example can be found in Bazon's research from 2011, where he discussed the use of student-directed introduction by middle school band teachers. And at the end, I'll provide all the references in case if you want to take a look at the articles. So the two different learning approaches are good for the student and they're very helpful. So I wanted to make it very clear. We just want to be aware of both, right? So the next definition will be performance cues. And performance cues are mental markings that musicians will keep track of the progress of a piece during the learning process and during the performance. A mental map of the piece that will guide the performer throughout. And the most important thing to understand about the performance cues is that all musicians have to understand the structure of the piece, how it makes sense, and how it would sound for them. The steps taken for the performance cues, they can be introduced as the students learn a new piece. And as they practice, the instructor can encourage them by making notes, making markings on the score to start the process of learning the cues and slowly memorizing it. So now into performance cues in piano music. I'm not sure about you guys, but for me, I always struggle with memorization at some point. And in my case, I've always struggled. And for the longest time, I couldn't find a safe way to memorize anything. I would just practice and practice until I had muscle memory. And we all know that's not ideal. So when I got into my PhD, I decided to start taking lessons again. In one of the semester, I started talking to my professor and we started looking at different memorization strategies. And that's when I got into the performance cues strategy. And there are several studies in different instruments that have used performance cues as a strategy to work on a safer memorization. But why is this one safer? Well, I like to say that we are going to take a look at the piece from a different perspective, or even we're going to take a step back and look at the big picture. Chafin has written several articles regarding the use of performance cues with professional musicians and students, and he found that so far, the memorization has been very helpful. And since we're talking about students here, I would like to share about one specific research that Chafin, Lisboa, and Demos have done, where they observed students throughout a semester while they learned the use of performance cues. And during the data collection, they students make markings on their scores based on different features that we are going to talk about here today, which are the basic, expression, and interpretation. And I actually decided to include those features in my study as part of all the other research that I have done. And we'll see markings such as basic for notes, interpretation for dynamics, in expression to determine feelings that the music could bring at that point. So you can see here in this slide, basic features that those pieces I worked with my students last year. So you see that I highlighted in red, fingering, hand placement, repetition, chord progression. So it's important to know also that all the pieces chosen for the study are on the level of group piano 3. So let's see the tarantella. You see that I marked hand crossing where the left hand goes up. For the minuet, I marked how the movement of the notes go, if it's up, if it's down, by step, by skip. And for the Bach, I wrote the chords that the broken chords are building, right? So they would see the whole picture instead of note by note. So you can take a second to look at it. I know it's quite small. And this one is interpretation features. So you see that I highlighted in this one in green. For this one, I marked dynamic contrast, crescendo, the crescendo, and I associated the dynamic movement with the basic features like the progressions and how it's going. So again, in the tarantella, you see that I marked the pedal. I marked the notes, they're going up by a step and how we can make that more sound. For the minuet, I wrote some dynamic markings as both hands are going up. We would have a little bit more sound. If they're going down, a little bit less. And for the interpretation and for the Bach, I wrote down how the chords can build that dynamic as well. For the last one is the expression features. and I highlighted in yellow articulations, jumps, and movements of each hand. So you can see that in yellow for the tarantella, I said sing the left hand just because it's a pretty good jump and you could have a feeling of how it's supposed to go. For the buck, I highlighted the very last three measures where we have the fast 16th note, and that's the fastest of the entire piece, and how we can bring that up as the end approaches. And for the minuet, I highlighted how the articulations can influence how the music goes. So at the end, all three features, they kind of blend in together as well. So based on all the readings of other studies regarding the learning approaches and the use of performance skills as a memorization strategy, I decided to compare the effects of student-directed and teacher-directed by using performance skills with group piano students. So with everything that I just said, I got to the purpose of my study and some research questions that guided throughout the pilot study. So some of the research questions are undergraduate music students aware of memorization strategies? Can performance skills help students to memorize pieces in group piano courses? Is there a difference between the learning approaches among the undergraduate students? And I got into my data collection. For the data collection, I used the three pieces that you just saw, and they all match kind of the level of group piano students. For their practice, they had 5 days to work on. So we got a new piece on the second day of class, so on a Thursday. They had up to 18 minutes to work on the piece for the first time, try to memorize, and then we would talk about performance skills, and they had it to Tuesday of the next week to do the second memorization recording. After the first 18 minutes, I had the two different groups. So for the student-directed group, we would talk of how we went, what can we do better, and as they guide me through the ideas, I would make markings on my score. So I would share my score with them, and I would make markings as they talked, and then I would engage them to mark as well, and I would answer any questions if they may have. They would get a chance to listen to others if they have any other questions. So it was a lot of discussion in between that time for the student directed. And for the teacher directed, I would also talk to them about the memorization process. I'll also talk to them about performance cues, and I hand to them all the cues in 3 different PDFs, so they could work on. So everything that I found to be good for them to memorize, I marked it down and sent it to them. The judges, I was not the one who graded them. So I picked 2 great piano teachers that have experience with group piano students, and they all graded each student into 3 categories: note accuracy, rhythm accuracy, and phrasing out of a 7-point Likert scale. And that's how I would see if there was any improvements between them. So after the study was done and I was able to run the numbers for each student, I found that all groups improved from the pre-test to the post-test, even if there was a small difference. And there was no significant difference between the student-directed and the teacher-directed approach. So both groups showed improvement from the treatment, which also tells me that both teaching approaches are just as valid. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you the descriptive of each group based on the 3 categories that they were tested on. So you see that the rhythm accuracy, they started with an average of 4.5, 4.87, and they finished with 5.56, 5.62. So there is a slight improvement for both groups. So to conclude this presentation, I want to share what I learned from my pilot study and what I am doing differently for this semester. So I'm exploring new repertoire with my students to have a strict training with the raters, which will give me a better reliability. And I am also sharing rubrics of grading among the raters for consistency. And finally, I was able to get a larger number of students this semester. So I opened the study for group piano 2 students with pieces of their own level, and group piano students 4 with pieces of their own level as well. And this was my pilot study. It was a great way of learning how to fully run a study and how I can make a difference. And I'm really excited to see how this semester study will turn out. And here are the references from the beginning. And thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much, Maria. Are there questions for Maria? Yes, applause. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And I probably have a couple questions, but does anyone else have a couple? My questions are probably just kind of from not, they're probably, it'd be easy to answer for you, I think. I kind of understand the general idea of student directed versus teacher directed. So for the study, is the difference just basically students marking their own scores versus the teachers like telling them how to mark their scores?
Yeah, so both of them is still got me introducing them the approach. So both of them got to experience what performance skills are. But the difference is that with teacher directed, after we talked through the piece, I gave them the scores with markings already that I found to be helpful for them to memorize. Such for the Bach that we saw, they had a broken C7 chord. So I'll just write it down, C7 to an F to a G. So they would see that. Whereas for the student directed, I would put my iPad on the visualizer and I'll talk with them. Like, okay, what do you guys think? What would be helpful? Like, is there any patterns or anything? So they would talk me through, and then I would write it down and they would write it down as well.
I see. And you probably went over this. So they all improved in the post-test. How long was it between the pre-test and the post-test? Was it?
It was 5 days.
5 days, okay.
They had 5 days, yeah. So there was a little improvement, not always. So that's something that I wanted to change for the semester. So some students had a good improvement to the post-test. Some students didn't. The bigger difference that I could see was between the first recording to the last recording. That was the bigger one. So it was a little bit inconsistent. So for this semester, I did differently. Instead of giving them 5 days, I gave them 7 days to work on. It was a little bit longer.
And sorry, this was another. So how did you test for like memorization specifically?
So they are graded into the 3 categories.
Okay.
Right. So they had to send me a video of them playing. So I would see it was by memory. And for this semester, they recorded in the piano lab. Okay. So I was there and I was able to see that they did by memory.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Yeah. So if they're more accurate with their notes or more accurate with their rhythm, that means it's memorized better. That's.
Yeah, that was the goal. Some of them did really well half of it, like perfectly memorize half of it for the second recording, whereas they did only half of the piece, like only one hand, the whole thing. So they were able to improve in a different way. So that's why we did a different rubric for this semester as well. So we have to make sure that there was a difference between each grading if they did half of the piece hands together or for an entire piece one hand.
Right. Okay, great. Is there any other questions for Maria? Yes, Dr. Pike.
I have a quick question, Maria. So, you know, I don't know, I haven't actually talked to you about this exactly, but I think part of the reason you used this approach with your study is because we talk so much in pedagogy and in teaching and in your music ed classes about how student autonomy and students being responsible for their own learning is so effective. Has your thinking changed at all based on these results? Like, do you feel, or maybe the better question that you can answer quickly is, what would you say the place of teacher directed learning is, since both clearly are helpful? Do you have any thoughts about that? I know that's beyond the scope of what this research was, but I'm just wondering if you've thought about it, because that's a practical application of your work.
Yeah, so at first, when I started reading about the teacher directed, it gave me an impression that it wasn't as good. You were relying too much on the teacher. But after last semester, I see that maybe at least at the beginning, the students do need you to tell them more, so they have a better idea of what is going on. And maybe that's why I saw that both groups improved, because they don't know memorization strategies, nor they don't know what performance skills are. So me really telling them, hey, this is what it is. I think this is helpful because of this, but explaining them where they actually know what's going on was very helpful. And I found that they appreciated that more. So it did change my view a little bit on teacher directed after last semester, after seeing the results and how they actually want and my help and everything.
I have one question, Maria. So you said that you started taking piano lessons again. How has this helped your own lessons?
My piano lessons?
Mhm.
I am not taking piano lessons this semester. Well, I had to stop, like PhD was getting into too much. I think it changed the way that I teach, because my study last semester was doing class time, and I felt that was taking too much time of the class time, so I decided to go outside. So I feel that that made my classes go a little bit differently. So I know that we do talk a lot about let them think and let them figure it out by themselves so they can get that. I think that approach of the teacher directed, the student directed, they kind of like blend in together, where yes, I do want them to share with their peers, but what if they don't know? They're just gonna waste time. So how can I guide them? So we chat a lot. So as they're practicing or they in breakout rooms, I send them a quick question so they have to reply to me. So I have an idea of where they are during that time of practice. So it's a little bit of both. But I have now trying lessons because I'm not taking lessons.
You have enough to worry about at this point. Other things.
A little bit.
Great. Well, thank you.
Okay, any other questions for Maria? If not, I wanted to turn the time over to Dr. Yang for just a minute or two. He's going to, as LMTA president, he's going to give us some short announcements and whatever he wants to say before we end.